Well, before going on with the topic of the third part of the Antediluvians, perhaps it is worth remembering that we were reading, in the last conference, quotes from Ellen White that spoke precisely on this topic. Today we will continue where we left off and, precisely, it will also be all about reading. We will comment on what we read. I don't know how far we are going to stay. The truth is that I have been reviewing everything that is still to come out in the conferences, and it is going to give us more than one conference for sure. The funny thing is that we will be reading quotes that tell us about the antediluvian characters, but we will also come back later to talk about Adam and Eve. What does one have to do with the other? Well, if we do not understand that Adam and Eve is a literal fact, we are going to be left in the dark about the character that appeared so many years later called Jesus. That is why it is interesting that we grasp the depth of reality and what happened with Adam and Eve and that situation that was created so that we understand what Jesus came to do in the history of mankind. That is why we cannot fall into the false concept that Catholicism is transmitting that they were simply stories for us to learn something, but that they were not reality, they were a myth. We are going to see once again the importance of the lesson that we can draw from this. We are now going to get into the subject with the third part about the Antediluvians, and we are going to start first with a biblical text found in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? These words of the Apostle Paul, he tells us that God's people are to be a special people set apart. This does not mean that they live as hermits, but it does mean that contact with unbelievers has to go to a certain point, because if there is a union, an unequal yoke, whether in marriage, whether in commerce, this is going to imply problems for the believer in all probability. So light and darkness are not together. There can be no communion between them. Either one is with God or one is not. So why have I put this here? Simply, I want to remind you of what we saw before, how the antediluvian people of God were doing very well, the descendants of Seth, until they began to link up with the other descendants of their brothers of Seth, those of Cain and his relatives. And from there on, the people of God, with their authentic beliefs, were mixed with what the others were doing, which was the opposite. And then this was the cause of the world going from bad to worse. Instead of the bad ones improving towards the good ones went towards the bad. And there remained only a small residue, a remnant of all that great people of old, who were the ones who finally preached the flood, and a few of them who did not die yet entered the ark and escaped. Well, from this we can draw even more lessons, because as it was of old, it will be even more so later on. We are going to keep reading some Ellen White's quotations from the same book where we left off in Patriarchs and Prophets. We left off on page 101. We are now on page 102. Because their life does not harmonize with the pure principles of God's moral government, they reject His warnings and deny the authority of His law. Of the vast population of the earth before the flood, only 8 souls believed and obeyed God's word through Noah. There is speculation as to how many people there were in that antediluvian world. We do not know exact numbers, but Ellen White's words are clear: huge antediluvian population. There were many inhabitants of the ancient world. As we said the other time, the antediluvian population could be the same as today, or perhaps even a little more. But all these people, as we read at the beginning, refused to follow the authority of the divine law. For 120 years, the preacher of righteousness warned the world of the coming destruction, but his message was rejected and despised. The same will happen now. So it will be now. Before the lawgiver shall come to punish the disobedient, transgressors are warned to repent and return to their allegiance, but with the majority these warnings will be in vain. Says the Apostle Peter, there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, dishonest pleasure desires in excess, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning. 2 Peter 3 and 4. It tells us that, in the end times, there would be people who would laugh at the fact that Jesus would return. Oh, this is what our forefathers said, and look, are we still like that? Curiously, let's see how she also says that this does not refer only to people who hear the truth for the first time, but also to people from God's church. Do we not hear these very words repeated, not merely by the openly ungodly, but by many who occupy the pulpits of our land? There is no cause for alarm, they cry. Before Christ shall come, all the world is to be converted, and righteousness is to reign for 1,000 years. This is what they say, the millennium. Peace, peace. All things continue as they were from the beginning. Let none be disturbed by the exciting message of these alarmists. They refer to those of us who say that Jesus is coming soon. This millennial doctrine is not in harmony with the teachings of Christ and the apostles. But this doctrine of the millennium does not harmonize with the teachings of Christ and his apostles. Jesus asked the significant question appearing on Luke 18 verse 8. When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? Speaking of himself, Christ recognized himself as the Son of Man. As we have seen, he manifests that the state of the world will be as in the days of Noah. Hence the importance for us to know what happened then in order to see how it will be fulfilled again. It will be in our days, and we can prepare ourselves for the return of Christ. Paul warns us that we may look for wickedness to increase as the end draws near. The Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. 1 Timothy 4 verse 1. We already see how Satan will not stand still and will use errors in the doctrines and also doctrines coming from demons so that many people will go astray. The apostle says that in the last days perilous times shall come. 2 Timothy 3 verse 1. And he gives a startling list of sins that will be found among those who have a form of godliness. Dangerous times are coming. Tell it to the Mexicans today, or tell it to any part of the world where there are so many problems. Citizen insecurity everywhere, terrorism, wars, conflicts, delinquency, there is more and more, it is unstoppable. It was prophesied that this would be so, and this is the same thing that happened in the days of Noah. The evil was going to more, not less. As the time of their probation was closing, the Antediluvians gave themselves up to exciting amusements and festivities. When we speak of the time of grace, it is the time that people have to accept Christ and surrender their lives to God and truly follow Him from the heart. That is known as the time of grace. The Antediluvians had it until the moment when the door of the ark was closed, and the world is having it even now until there is a certain moment in history when that too will end. It will be the end of that time of grace. But you see what they were dedicated to: amusements and festivities. Need I tell you how the situation is today in our society? People only think about having fun, about festivities. The same as before. Those who possessed influence and power were bent on keeping the minds of the people engrossed with mirth and pleasure, lest any should be impressed by the last solemn warning. Interesting. This was done by those who possessed influence and power. Who would they be? Religious leaders, and they could also be people in power. History always seems to repeat itself, doesn't it? Don't we see the same thing happening again today? Yes, indeed. Do we not see the same repeated in our day? While God's servants are giving the message that the end of all things is at hand, the world is absorbed in amusements and pleasure-seeking. There is a constant round of excitement that causes indifference to God and prevents the people from being impressed by the truths which alone can save them from the coming destruction. Well, as I have a lot of contact with young people, I can confirm that this is so. Above all, people need excitement. To have a good time all the time, pleasures, as many as possible. Well, what does all this cause in the minds of the people? That the relaxed things, the things that can unite God, do not have emotion for the minds, and that is dismissed. And while we are distracted with excitements, we will not want to unite with God, because God says that there are things that we should not do for our own good, but we like evil, so let's go on with it. And so no one prepares himself. In Noah's day, philosophers declared that it was impossible for the world to be destroyed by water, so now there are men of science who endeavor to show that the world cannot be destroyed by fire, which is how it will happen in the end, that this would be inconsistent with the laws of nature. But the God of nature, the maker and controller of her laws, can use the works of his hands to serve his own purpose. God is above all. When the great sages had proved to their entire satisfaction that it was impossible the world to be destroyed by water, when great and wise men had proved to their satisfaction that it was impossible for the world to be destroyed by water, when the fears of the people were quieted, when all regarded Noah's prophecy as a delusion, and looked upon him as a fanatic, then it was that God's time had come. The fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the scoffers were overwhelmed in the waters of the flood. With all their boasted philosophy, men found too late that their wisdom was foolishness, that the lawgiver is greater than the laws of nature, and that omnipotence is at no loss for means to accomplish his purposes. As it was in the days of Noah, even thus shall it be in the days when the Son of Man is revealed. Luke 17:26 and 30. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise. Do we realize how she is describing the coming of Jesus? And the elements shall melt with fervent heat, the earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. 2 Peter 3 verse 10. When the reasoning of philosophy has banished the fear of God's judgments, when religious teachers are pointing forward to long ages of peace and prosperity, and the world are absorbed in their rounds of business and pleasure, planting and building, feasting and merrymaking, rejecting God's warnings and mocking his messengers, then it is that sudden destruction cometh upon them, and they shall not escape. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 3. It is interesting when we reason these words. There is a moment in history that we are living now. What is crisis? We cannot speak now that we are continually building and prospering. We could only go so far as to talk about still trying to maintain diversions and feasts. The people who are now preaching that Jesus is coming back soon because of the signs, some of them are being ridiculed. But now the world is in a time of crisis, and in the face of the crisis the people, and if not tried, speak to them of these things, and you will see that they are not all scoffers. Because now, for a moment of time, they are receptive to the approach of what we can give them as a message. Of course, we must know how to face it. But interestingly, when these words are written, they are telling us that there will be business already in motion. There will be planting and building. There is going to be a time in human history when there will be a resurgence of prosperity in the world. This will happen at a certain historical moment in the future. And this has to do precisely with the coming of the false Messiah. And people are going to dedicate themselves to all this inordinately, and they will no longer prepare themselves, because they will believe that they will already have those 1,000 years of peace that all the Christian religions are teaching and that are a lie. The 1,000 years of peace will not be here on earth, as they will not prepare themselves. The true Christ will surprise them. Let's go to chapter 8 of this book. After the flood, we are going to see only up to the end of this page, where she tells us, the waters rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains. She is already talking about the time of the flood. The measurement that went from the elbow of a man's arm to the fingertips is approximately 45 to 50 centimeters. It often seemed to the family within the ark that they must perish, as for 5 long months their boat was tossed about, apparently at the mercy of wind and wave. It was a trying ordeal, but Noah's faith did not waver, for he had the assurance that the divine hand was upon the helm. Of course, it was not simply being in the ark and that was all, but it was a tremendous convulsion of forces. As the waters began to subside, the Lord caused the ark to drift into a spot protected by a group of mountains that had been preserved by His power. These mountains were but a little distance apart, and the ark moved about in this quiet haven, and was no longer driven upon the boundless ocean. This gave great relief to the weary, tempest-tossed voyagers. Now we would have to remember, when one of the conferences we presented Ron Wyatt and the proofs he gave of having found the ark precisely on Mount Ararat in Turkey. To those who enter again in this conference, I refer you to a previous one, where we precisely present how he relates this event and the evidence he showed about it. Later on, in another conference, we will speak again precisely about Ron Wyatt and not this ark, the Ark of Noah, but the Ark of the Covenant. Noah and his family anxiously waited for the decrease of the waters, for they longed to go forth again upon the earth. 40 days after the tops of the mountains became visible, they sent out a raven, a bird of quick scent, to discover whether the earth had become dry. This bird, finding nothing but water, continued to fly to and from the ark. 7 days later a dove was sent forth, which, finding no footing, returned to the ark. Noah waited 7 days longer, and again sent forth the dove. When she returned at evening with an olive leaf in her mouth, there was great rejoicing. Let us realize again the importance of number 7. Later Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and, behold, the face of the ground was dry. Genesis 8 verse 13. Still he waited patiently within the ark. As he had entered at God's command, he waited for special directions to depart. It was when an angel finally descends from heaven and opens that massive door and, at last, they can get out. But our story will stop here. We will not go beyond what happens next. But we are going to make a little reminder that appears in Genesis 9 of what happened when they come out of the ark. There is a dialogue between God and Noah. From verse 8 onwards he tells us, "And God spake unto Noah, and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, and of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark, to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. Therefore, let us be clear that the earth will not be destroyed again by a flood. And God said, This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth." Which arch was he referring to? God. This one, the rainbow. Recall verses 13 and 14. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. I do not know if you, when you see this arch, are impressed. Because sometimes it appears with a tremendous beauty, with an impressive sharpness of colors. For anyone who sees the ark, it can truly surprise the wonder that it appears like this. Obviously, it has a physical explanation. We already know them. But for the believer, this has a much deeper significance. When it starts to rain, we see that the ark appears. It is usually because of the refraction with the sun. The thought of the Christian is different from that of the other human being in general. He knows that something happened many years ago that caused this situation, and this should remind us that God made a covenant with Noah and his descendants, that is, with us too. And God continues to hold us so as not to destroy us by flood. No matter how bad we do things, He still has mercy on us, but there will come a time when His mercy, that time of grace, will end. And then the earth will no longer be destroyed by water, but by fire at the return of Jesus. And I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, This is the token of the covenant, which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. God continues to keep His covenant, and every time we see this in heaven, let us remember this covenant of God with man, and let us not just look at it as, look, how curious, how beautiful this looks. God continues to show it to us so that we remember what happened, and what is going to happen again, but in the meantime, He still has mercy on us. And now we are going to enter into the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary, Volume 7a, which are also Ellen White's writings. And precisely, now we are also going to enter into remembering more situations that Adam and his descendants lived. When Adam was assailed by the tempter in Eden, he was without the taint of sin. He stood before God in the strength of perfect manhood. All the organs and faculties of his being were equally developed and harmoniously balanced. His body and his mind were in good conditions. Sin had not entered him, he had not deteriorated at all. Therefore, let us think, if being in this condition he came to sin, what happened later with Christ when he came to be able to redeem man from the transgression that Adam had caused? Did he come in the same condition as Adam? Different? What is the importance of all this for us? We will see. Christ, in the wilderness of temptation, stood in Adam's place to bear the test he failed to endure. Here Christ overcame, in the sinner's behalf, for 1,000 years after Adam turned his back upon the light of his home. Separated from the presence of God, the human family had been departing, each successive generation, further from the original purity, wisdom, and knowledge which Adam possessed in Eden. Christ bore the sins and infirmities of the race as they existed when he came to the earth to help man. In behalf of the race, with the weaknesses of fallen man upon him, he was to stand the temptations of Satan upon all points on which man could be assailed. What a contrast the second Adam presented as he entered the gloomy wilderness to cope with Satan single-handed. Since that fall, the race had been decreasing in size and physical strength, and sinking lower in the scale of moral worth, up to the period of Christ's advent to the earth. In order to elevate fallen man, Christ must reach him where he was. He took human nature and bore the infirmities and degeneracy of the race. He who knew no sin became sin for us. He humiliated himself to the lowest depths of human woe, that he might be qualified to reach man and bring him up from the degradation in which sin had plunged him. If we notice here, we see how the human race with the passing of the generations had been diminishing in stature, in intellectual power, in capacities. And that is the nature that Christ takes humanly. He does not come as Adam, of an impressive stature, nor with an absolute perfection in everything. He comes as a man of his time. And with that deterioration of the burden of sin that he carried in his body for generations, he assumes that very thing. He does not depart as Adam in this sense, but he departs in even worse condition. And instead, thanks to his not sinning, he saves what Adam came to lose in Eden. The Lord created man out of the dust of the earth. He made Adam a partaker of his life, his nature. There was breathed into him the breath of the Almighty, and he became a living soul. Adam was perfect in form, strong, comely, pure, bearing the image of his Maker. There are very important details here. Man was made from the dust of the earth, from the mud, the text tells us, from a reddish clay, and I don't know if I ever mentioned it here. Curiously, when we have muscle tears due to training injuries or any circumstance, when we apply that fresh reddish mud on the affected area, we wrap it with a cloth typical of the sheets of the past and rest with it. And we do that several times. Then we clean ourselves obviously. We regenerate our tissues in an impressive way, much better than with ointments and anything else. Why is that? Because we have the same components as the reddish mud. And thanks to the fact that we can't or our body absorbs what we have lost in those ruptures, through the mud that we have applied outside, we can regenerate better. Because that mud is what we are made of, and it is what we have lost that we recover. You know that I dedicate myself precisely to the subject of bodybuilding, helping to teach people to train, to take care of themselves. And whenever I have told them this, they have been amazed, and when they have tried it, they have seen that it really works, and that is why I want to transmit it here too, if any of you have any of these types of injuries, so that you can put it into practice and see how it really works. The mud, when you get up, you find it totally cracked as if it were dry land that has not rained, and then that is cleaned with a shower jet. But there comes a moment, when the disease is healed, that the mud no longer cracks. It is still wet when we get up. And then it is because we have already recovered all those nutrients that we had lost. It is curious that when Moses writes that man was made from mud, science shows us that we are the same. How could Moses have known this in those times? We see that Adam was perfect in everything. We are going to see more details of all this. There is also an interesting part of what we have read. Man lives by the breath of God and becomes a living soul, a living being. Let us notice how the term soul does not mean someone stripped of his body, who swarms around when one dies or something like that, but the soul is a being, it is the person. And it can be living soul or dead soul. It depends if the breath of God is in you or not. This is interesting to begin to throw away the concept of soul that takes us to the world of spiritism, and from which all Christianity has practically sucked. And this we must keep in mind. Be careful with the concept of soul. Someday we will deal precisely with the subject of death, God willing. There are so many topics to deal with. Man came from the hand of his Creator, perfect in organization and beautiful in form. So God didn't make any monkeys or any strange little bugs that later evolved. The fact that he has for 6,000 years withstood the ever-increasing weight of disease and crime is conclusive proof of the power of endurance with which he was first endowed. Interesting. Adam was crowned king in Eden. To him was given dominion over every living thing that God had created. The Lord blessed Adam and Eve with intelligence such as he had not given to any other creature. He made Adam the rightful sovereign over all the works of his hands. Man, made in the divine image, could contemplate and appreciate the glorious works of God in nature. We were made in the divine image, not as a rare species of anything. And we must always keep this in mind. We are in the divine image, but we must preserve it as much as we can, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Because if not, how can we claim to be children of God? In order to be children of God, we must remember our origins, and we must want to remain children of God from the beginning to the end. Adam had themes for contemplation in the works of God in Eden, which was heaven in miniature. It's interesting. It was the sky in miniature. If the Garden of Eden, she says it was a miniature heaven, what is heaven like? Is it a place where there are only clouds and they are walking, floating? As we are so often shown in advertisements, movies, and so on. Well, no. Here he is describing what heaven is like. God did not form man merely to contemplate his glorious works. Therefore, he gave him hands for labor, as well as a mind and heart for contemplation. If the happiness of man consisted in doing nothing, the Creator would not have given Adam his appointed work. Man was to find happiness in labor, as well as in meditation. Why are we now seeing so many problems in mankind? Why are we seeing people who are unemployed becoming mentally distressed? Because this is not the natural condition for man. Man needs to work for the good of his body and for his mind. But he also needs something important, and that is meditation. One can work, and one can be meditating. Also, one can be still, and one can meditate also. But the person who is always still is always idle. For whatever circumstances, his mind will not be in meditation, because his body also asks for something else. Therefore, balance is necessary in the human being. God created man for his own glory, that after test and trial the human family might become one with the heavenly family. It was God's purpose to repopulate heaven with the human family if they would show themselves obedient to his every word. Have you seen what it says here? The human being was made to restore the losses, which Satan and his angels created in heaven when they were expelled. There were empty places left, and God's purpose was to create man to fill that heaven again, provided man had been perfect to the end. Interesting concept, isn't it? Why do you think Satan hates man and his angels so much? Because we were to be his substitutes. Adam was to be tested to see whether he would be obedient as the loyal angels or disobedient. If he stood the test, his instruction to his children would have been only of loyalty. His mind and thoughts would have been as the mind and thoughts of God. He would have been taught by God as his husbandry and building. His character would have been molded in accordance with the character of God. And our character is currently far away from God's character. All because of transgression. And pay attention to what you are about to read now as well. Christ never planted the seeds of death in the system. Satan planted these seeds when he tempted Adam to eat of the tree of knowledge, which meant disobedience to God. In other words, the seeds of death in the organism come from Satan, not from God. When God tells you that he would die to the human being for transgressing, it is because he knows that Satan could automatically put this in the human being, and we all die for having separated ourselves from God. That is why science can do nothing to stop death. It can prolong life a little longer, but it cannot suppress the great enemy of mankind, which is death, because Satan is the master of mankind until Christ puts an end to it. Adam listened to the words of the tempter, and yielding to his insinuations, fell into sin. Why was not the death penalty at once enforced in his case? Because a ransom was found. God's only begotten Son volunteered to take the sin of man upon himself and to make an atonement for the fallen race. There could have been no pardon for sin had this atonement not been made. Had God pardoned Adam's sin without an atonement, sin would have been immortalized and would have been perpetuated with a boldness that would have been without restraint. It is interesting. If we fall into evolutionary concepts or concepts of little Martians who created us and gave us life, etc., we don't understand that God was the one who created us as we were in perfection, but as humans. The whole concept that Jesus had to come to die so that we could be saved to restore what was lost, the concept of why Jesus came to earth would also be lost. So, how difficult it is to understand that Catholicism now proclaims that evolution is a fact until the human being comes out as such. The other time, in the other conference, we talked about the stupidity of that argument, because for there to be evolution there had to be death, and death had not entered until sin entered. That was already something extremely impossible. But in addition, now we see this other reasoning. If we destroy creation, as narrated in Genesis, we totally deprive Christ of what he came to do on earth. If the race had ceased to fall when Adam was driven from Eden, we should now be in a far more elevated condition physically, mentally, and morally. But while men deplore the fall of Adam, which has resulted in such unutterable woe, they disobey the express injunctions of God, as did Adam, although they have his example to warn them from doing as he did in violating the law of Jehovah. Once again, we take the teaching of this fact from Adam. Would that man had stopped falling with Adam? But there has been a succession of falls. Men will not take warning from Adam's experience. And even more so now, if it is said that he did not exist, that he is a myth. They will indulge appetite and passion in direct violation of the law of God, and at the same time continue to mourn Adam's transgression, which brought sin into the world. From Adam's day to ours there has been a succession of falls, each greater than the last, and every species of crime. God did not create a race of beings so devoid of health, beauty, and moral power as now exists in the world. Hence, we are now a total atrophy of what God had made in the beginning. Disease of every kind has been fearfully increasing upon the race. This has not been by God's especial providence, but directly contrary to his will. It has come by man's disregard of the very means which God has ordained to shield him from the terrible evils existing. Whose fault is it? Ours. Let us not blame God for our diseases and so many other things, because most of the time it is our fault, because we do not do what God has dictated to us on how to preserve our own health. And to this we add the previous generations of sin. Logically, our tendency is not going to be super powerful beings, because evil nests in us, sin. But at least let's do our best to avoid all this. In Eden, Satan used the serpent as his instrument. Today he makes use of the members of the human family, striving by means of every species of cunning and deception to hedge up the path of righteousness cast up for the ransomed of the Lord to walk in. Now Satan is using people to screw up the straight and narrow way. God does not consult our opinions or preferences. He knows what human beings do not know, the future results of every movement, and therefore our eyes should be directed to him, and not to the worldly advantages presented by Satan. Satan tells us that if we give heed to him, we shall reach great heights of knowledge. Ye shall be as gods, he said to Eve, if you eat of the tree forbidden by God. I do not know if you now remember how the New Age is telling us the same thing, and other spiritualist beliefs, that we are gods, that we carry the inner God within us, that we are God. But what a nonsense! We are created beings. Satan used that same argument to make Eve succumb. And now he is using it through these movements so that people do not depend on Christ, on his death on the cross, for us, and on his intervention and mediation in the heavenly sanctuary so that we are freed from the final payment in the judgment. It is curious, Satan does not change. He always works with the same thing. Only he adapts it to the circumstances and the moment. The test given to Adam and Eve was very light, but they could not bear it. They disobeyed God, and this transgression opened the floodgates of woe on our world. With what intense interest the whole universe watched the conflict that was to decide the position of Adam and Eve. How attentively the angels listened to the words of Satan, the originator of sin, as he placed his own ideas above the commands of God, and sought to make of none effect the law of God through his deceptive reasoning. How anxiously they waited to see if the holy pair would be deluded by the tempter and yield to his arts. They asked themselves, will the holy pair transfer their faith and love from the Father and Son to Satan? Will they accept his falsehoods as truth? They knew that they might refrain from taking the fruit and obey the positive injunction of God, or they might violate the express command of their Creator. The mildest test was given them that could be given, for there was no need of their eating of the forbidden tree. Everything that their wants required had been provided. But Satan was already in charge of presenting it in such an attractive way, to be like God, knowing good and evil. In fact, knowing evil, because good was already history. If Adam and Eve had never touched the forbidden tree, the Lord would have imparted to them knowledge upon which rested no curse of sin, knowledge that would have brought them everlasting joy. The only knowledge they gained by their disobedience was a knowledge of sin and its results. In what consisted the strength of the assault made upon Adam, which caused his fall? It was not indwelling sin, for God made Adam after his own character, pure and upright. There were no corrupt principles in the first Adam, no corrupt propensities or tendencies to evil. Adam was as faultless as the angels before God's throne. These things are inexplainable, but many things which now we cannot understand will be made plain when we shall see as we are seeing, and know as we are known. There are things that we can hardly understand and explain now. But there will come a time when Christ has returned that we will understand. Age after age, the curiosity of men has led them to seek for the tree of knowledge, and often they think they are plucking fruit most essential, when, like Solomon's research, they find it altogether vanity and nothingness in comparison with that science of true holiness which will open to them the gates of the city of God. But Satan always works with the occult. Yes, search within yourself and you will find the truth. Go within yourself, let that which is outside the cosmos enter into you, that force, etc. All is satanic deception to draw us away from God. The human ambition has been seeking for that kind of knowledge that will bring to them glory and self-exaltation and supremacy. Thus Adam and Eve were worked upon by Satan until God's restraint was snapped asunder, and their education under the teacher of lies began in order that they might have the knowledge which God had refused them, to know the consequence of transgression. And this is how Satan instructs the fallen human beings in all those doctrines and false beliefs, which became part of all the human people who did not follow the designs of God as the descendants of Seth did. And from there, everything became more complicated until the flood. And from there, after the flood, we advance to our history, with once again the repetition of the events prior to the flood, and of which we will see many more details that will surprise us very much to see what extraordinary parallelism with the present time. Adam yielded to temptation, and as we have the matter of sin and its consequences laid so distinctly before us, we can read from cause to effect and see the greatness of the act is not that which constitutes sin, but the disobedience of God's expressed will, which is a virtual denial of God, refusing the laws of his government. The fall of our first parents broke the golden chain of implicit obedience of the human will to the divine. Obedience has no longer been deemed an absolute necessity. The human agents follow their own imaginations, which the Lord said of the inhabitants of the old world were evil, and that continually. And that happened before the flood. It is still happening and will happen even more. The plan of salvation was arranged in such a way that when Adam was tested, temptation was kept away from him as much as possible. When Adam was tempted, he was not hungry. Funny, eh? Satan gave Eve to eat. Eve accepted. When Eve gives Adam of the fruit, Adam is not hungry at that time at all, but instead he succumbs, even easier to refuse. God had power to hold Adam back from touching the forbidden fruit, but had he done this, Satan would have been sustained in his charge against God's arbitrary rule. Man would not have been a free moral agent, but a mere machine. That's why God could not forbid him, saying, "Don't take it." But rather, he had to leave him to his free will, to do what he wanted, to decide for himself. That was part of God's great love. He didn't make a machine, he made a man, and the man decided to sin. But you see, if God had intervened, Satan had the great argument to say, look, this way anyone serves you, right? You force him. And Satan's character would not have been exposed to the universe. It certainly was not God's purpose that man should be sinful. He made Adam pure and noble, with no tendency to evil. He placed him in Eden, where he had every inducement to remain loyal and obedient. The law was placed around him as a safeguard. And we now see the law, the 10 Commandments too, as a hardship. Oops, don't do this, don't do that. Phew. But then, what can I do? We see it as so traumatic, if that is made for our safeguard, so that we don't end up bad, but we to our own. Adam and Eve both ate of the fruit, and obtained a knowledge which, had they obeyed God, they would never have had, an experience in disobedience and disloyalty to God, the knowledge that they were naked. The garment of innocence, a covering from God, which surrounded them, departed. They were dressed in a breath of light that covered them. The moment they transgress, that breath of light is gone. That energy with which God endows them loosens, because they have separated themselves from the source of life, which is God, the source of light. And they supplied the place of this heavenly garment by sewing together fig leaves for aprons. What a pity! This is the covering that the transgressors of the law of God have used since the days of Adam and Eve's disobedience. They have sewed together fig leaves to cover their nakedness, caused by transgression. The fig leaves represent the arguments used to cover disobedience. When the Lord calls the attention of men and women to the truth, the making of fig leaves into aprons will be begun, to hide the nakedness of the soul. But the nakedness of the sinner is not covered. All the arguments pieced together by all who have interested themselves in this flimsy work will come to naught. By making excuses, obstacles, these leaves are sewn together. They are useless. Had Adam and Eve never disobeyed their Creator, had they remained in the path of perfect rectitude, they could have known and understood God. But when they listened to the voice of the tempter and sinned against God, the light of the garments of heavenly innocence departed from them, and in parting with the garments of innocence, they drew about them the dark robes of ignorance of God. The clear and perfect light that had hitherto surrounded them had lightened everything they approached. Impressive. But deprived of that heavenly light, the posterity of Adam could no longer trace the character of God in his created works. How interesting to see how the human being was clothed with this light. And I do not know if there are people who have seen a preaching that I presented on the angels of God, which also appears on the same page where the conferences are posted, in which we see how the angels are also clothed with something very similar. But they keep it because they have not transgressed the law. Adam and Eve, at their creation, had a knowledge of the law of God. It was printed on their hearts, and they understood its claims upon them. When they transgressed the law of God, and fell from their state of happy innocence, and became sinners, the future of the fallen race was not relieved by a single ray of hope. God pitied them, and Christ devised the plan for their salvation by himself bearing the guilt. Their own Creator. When the curse was pronounced upon the earth and upon man, in connection with the curse was a promise that through Christ there was hope and pardon for the transgression of God's law. Although gloom and darkness hung, like the pall of death, over the future, yet in the promise of the Redeemer, the star of hope lighted up the dark future. The gospel was first preached to Adam by Christ. Adam and Eve felt sincere sorrow and repentance for their guilt. They believed the precious promise of God and were saved from utter ruin. As soon as there was sin, there was a Savior. Christ knew that he would have to suffer, yet he became man's substitute. As soon as Adam sinned, the Son of God presented himself as surety for the human race, with just as much power to avert the doom pronounced upon the guilty as when he died upon the cross of Calvary. Well, we stop reading here. The quotes continue. There are still quotes to come, I would say, as interesting or more than the ones we have read so far. If we do not perceive that all this was a literal fact, Jesus came to earth to fool around. Do we really believe that Jesus came only to play the fool on earth? Why has it been so interesting to distort that Jesus was on earth? Why has it been so interesting to distort what Christ did here, dying on the cross? Why has it been so interesting for evolution to appear, to spread everywhere, and to stain the image of God by creating man? Why is it so interesting that talking about creationism is already being forbidden in schools in many places? Because Satan does not want people to consider that Christ came to die so that man could be saved. Jesus did not come only to teach as a great teacher, to be the best teacher of all history. Jesus came to save man, and for that it was necessary his death on the cross. If we throw away everything that happened in creation, we are lost, because we will not understand what Christ has done for us, and it will prevent us from approaching God seeking him with heart and repentance. and we cannot prepare ourselves to wait for his second coming, and we cannot expect to be saved from the destruction that is coming upon the earth. We do not know if we are going to die before Christ returns or not, but what matters most to us is to be saved for eternity, and to return to be as man was originally in his creation, and to be at last in peace, tranquility, knowledge of God, and harmony among all. This is the key to understand the maneuvers that the Vatican is doing through the secret societies and through its own statements to destroy the origin of man. There are some lectures of a colleague of ours where he presents in several parts the lie of evolution. I recommend them to you. They are also posted on our web pages where the lectures appear, because in a clear way that even a child can understand, you can see the false movements and the lying arguments they use to demolish creationism. And now people who talk about creationism are labeled as religious fanatics. Funny, Satan always has the word fanatic used against those who say the things God wants them to say. He used it with the ancient prophets, they used it with Jesus, they used it with the Apostle Paul, they used it in the Middle Ages. They use it now, and more than they are going to use it when the problems start here in a very short time. Because that is going to be the argument to go against the true people of God. Well, I may leave you here. In the next conference, we will try to present the subject of the Pope's visit to Germany, because we are really going to see how many things have a great connection with all this and with what awaits us. But, in addition, if it is not possible to present it, or if it is possible also if there is time, we will continue with the fourth part of the antediluvian world topic. Thank you very much. See you next time.